A couple of years ago, back when I was a little more into true crime than I am now, I became incredibly interested in cults. From the strange and surreal to the apocalyptic and incredibly dangerous, cults are something that we've come to accept as a part of the world we live in. While they're certainly not completely gone, the heyday of doomsday cults, particularly in America, was around the 80s and 90s. Sagebrush by Redact Games depicts the aftermath of a fictional cult named Perfect Heaven. Back in the 1990s, the group established a compound named the Black Sage Ranch, and the members would live and work there until one fateful day when the entire group collectively took their lives. Now, an unknown amount of time later, you explore the remains of said ranch, piecing together the lives of the people who were convinced by the charismatic Father James to uproot their lives and start again, and the events that led to the end of the group. Gameplay-wise, it's a very simple exploration game with minimalist puzzles. While a lot of the puzzles are solved by finding keys and passcodes for locked doors, where the game really shines is in its atmosphere. When you first arrive at Black Sage Ranch, it seems incredibly peaceful. The music is soft, the sun is low in the sky, and everything is lit up in a sort of orange haze. It seems a lot closer to an old summer camp than the site of a horrific event. But even in the early stages of the game, the signs are there. One of the most telling details early on is in the bathrooms, where a Bible verse hangs on the wall. In the men's room, it reads like a typical passage about cleanliness and purity. However, the passage in the women's room is far more sinister. The more doors you unlock and the more flashbacks you listen to, the more the true nature of the compound starts to reveal itself. Like most cults, Perfect Heaven seemed like an accepting place for people of all kinds to come together and find purpose. Some were homeless and had crippling addictions, others were disenfranchised with their previous religions, and some felt like they had nowhere else to go. But from the very beginning, you know how their story ends. This is something that a lot more cult-centric media should do. Some tend to focus far too much on the charismatic leaders, the so-called prophets who manage to convince a group of regular individuals to commit terrible acts. People want to know how someone can convince grown adults to let their lives be completely controlled by someone they barely know, and I understand that. I think that's what draws many people towards the topic of cults in the first place. But what Sagebrush does is redirect the focus to the victims, and in doing so, manages to tell a much more somber and tragic story. While Father James's presence is felt all through the compound and in each person's writings, we don't get a glimpse into his actual life or what he was like for most of the game. As you explore the compound, the story becomes darker and darker, and the setting sun reflects this. Black Sage Ranch begins to contort, and loses the peaceful facade it held at the start of the game. As you read about Father James changing his rules and teachings on a whim, it becomes clear that not everyone on the compound was a violent zealot who would do anything for their faith. Most of them were merely too brainwashed and beaten down to do anything about it. Even when they believed something was wrong, they were taught to trust his words over their own. This story is incredibly dark, and not just because of the tragic end. A lot of the group's teachings and forms of penance are hard to read about if you're squeamish. If you're familiar with a lot of the typical actions of specifically male cult leaders, then some of the later revelations won't shock you, but they are nevertheless hard to read. The game took me about 90 minutes to beat, and if you intend to soak up the atmosphere and find as many notes as possible, it'll probably take you around that long. I won't spoil any of the later revelations and twists, but I will leave you with this. A note from about halfway through the game that I believe sums up the tone perfectly. Thou shalt not kill. But it's not that simple, is it? We are God's army. We must protect our flock. This is a war, with souls on the line. We must be resolute, unwavering. So why won't my hands stop shaking? Why do I keep seeing his face when I close my eyes? Somehow I didn't think fighting for the Lord would mean beating an unarmed man to death with a shovel. Lord, why won't my hands stop shaking? Continuing our lo-fi trend, VHS 1986 is a game about a set of tapes that you really shouldn't be watching. You borrowed some blank tapes from a friend. However, after bringing them home with you, he realizes he accidentally gave you the wrong ones. The set he gave you belongs to a Dutchman, and he was only meant to be holding them for him, so he offers to meet you tomorrow to get them back. In the meantime, you decide that there's no harm in checking them out. Unfortunately, this assumption is very wrong. The game plays out very simply. You pick pick up a tape, watch it, and repeat. Each tape has a title, and is a mixture of handheld video footage of people exploring some unknown city and American public broadcasting. The game very clearly fits into the analog horror style found footage trend that has been incredibly popular in the last few years, and out of the quite literally dozens of horror games I've played that have tried this style, this one might be the most successful of the bunch. Each tape jumps back and forth between disparate events, with times and dates changing rapidly between cuts, along with the jarring changes between regular footage and recorded television broadcasts. All of it looks convincingly like it could be a few decades old, and while I imagine the news footage is from the time period, I'd be interested to know how the live action footage was recorded, whether it was on an actual old tape video camera and digitally transferred, or if it was just edited incredibly well to look authentic. It takes a lot of work to make it look right, so whatever way it was accomplished, I applaud it. Your objective is relatively unclear beyond just watching the tapes. However, the strange poster on your wall covered in symbols is clearly trying to tell you something. After viewing each tape, your phone will ring as your friend frantically tries to get a response from you. Whoever the Dutchman is, he clearly doesn't want anyone seeing whatever is on those tapes, and is desperately trying to get them back. This one only lasts about 20 minutes, depending on how quickly you pick up on the puzzle you need to solve. And since most of the gameplay revolves around scrubbing through footage, I haven't got too much to say. The perspective and the way everything moves is very unique. I'm a big fan of the 2D, 3D effect, like how the phone bounces when you click on it. It's very reminiscent of Smile for me, which is always a good comparison. It's also important to note that this game was created by Paper Cookies, the person behind No Players Online, and if you know anything about their work, you'll know there might be something hidden below the surface. VHS 1986 is an excellent attempt at bringing the fear of analog horror to video games. Who doesn't love a good slasher movie? There's something about a person stumbling into an incredibly dangerous situation and not realizing until it's too late that makes for entertaining horror, and that's exactly what Cannibal Abduction is about. The latest game from Celloi is a Texas Chainsaw-esque horror game where you play as Henry, a rebellious teenager who took his dad's car to get away for a few days. While driving down the highway and enjoying his taste of freedom, his car begins to stall out, leaving him stranded in the middle of nowhere. Thankfully, a passing truck pulls over and offers to help him out. The stranger claims that he's a mechanic, and says he can fix up his car no problem. When they make it back to the farmhouse, the stranger offers him a deal. He'll fix up Henry's car if Henry repairs an old wardrobe in the house that he hasn't gotten time to get around to yet. Seeming like a fair exchange, Henry agrees, and heads into the house to get to work. Unfortunately, as you probably expect from the title, the house isn't what it seems. After a while of working on the door, the sun starts to go down, and Henry decides to ask the stranger for something to light the room up, only to learn that the door he came in from was now locked. After picking the lock with a spare bobby pin, Henry finds himself alone in the house, with a note outside the room referring to him as a nice young stray, and warning whoever the note was for not to play with the food. If the title didn't give it away, Tucker Farm is home to a family of cannibals, and Henry is their next meal. With the doors locked and no way to contact the police, your job is to explore the house and find a way out. Of course, it's not that simple, and the creaking floorboards and loud footsteps imply that Henry isn't home alone. If you've been keeping up with my other itch.io videos, you might recognize the similarities with the developer's previous game titled The Night of the Scissors. While they share a passing resemblance, Cannibal Abduction is absolutely a step up in quality. Firstly, the Tucker house is much tighter and better designed. Each section of the house has multiple entrances, but they're locked behind different mechanics. Some are boarded up with wood, others require a specific key, and some need to be picked. The more of the house you unlock, the easier it is to maneuver and plan your escape routes. Secondly, this game features an item box and inventory system. Henry can only carry 4 items, and that includes his flashlight. A lot of the time you'll find yourself having to choose between running back upstairs to make room for something and risk running into whatever is stalking you, or just leaving it there until you have a chance to come back for it later. Speaking of something stalking you, Cannibal Abduction features a very similar enemy to the Snipper from Night of the Scissors. Every time you turn a corner or open a door, there's a chance you'll run into one of the Tuckers, and if that happens, you need to start running. There are a couple of hiding spots scattered all over the house, and if you manage to run far enough away from the enemy, you'll lose him. Thankfully, he's not a particularly fast cannibal, so most of the time you should be able to get away if you know where you're going. The puzzles you have to solve to advance the story are relatively straightforward. As long as you explore thoroughly and check everything in each room, you shouldn't run into any problems. The game even rewards you with an alternate ending if you decide to take your time and really explore the house, which I appreciated. If I had to give any criticisms, it would be that the base controls for Henry are a little bit sensitive. The game uses tank controls and fixed camera angles to navigate the house, and when you encounter the enemy, sometimes Henry spins a bit too far and throws you off course, leading to you running into a wall instead of up the stairs. However, if you play a lot of tank control horror games, it shouldn't be too big of an adjustment. The story is also a lot more involved this time around. As Henry tries to find his way out, he discovers notes written by Fred Tucker, who had started noticing his family's strange behavior. The notes depict what happened to Fred, but also offer hints towards different puzzles, so they serve a dual purpose. Cannibal Abduction only takes about an hour to beat, and I would highly recommend showing it your support. Discover the story of the Tucker family, help Henry escape the fate of previous victims, and if you're brave enough, find out what truly lies beneath the house. What would you do if you were trapped in your home? I don't just mean the doors are locked, I mean you have no communication with the outside world, and the only way out is completely blocked. This is the situation Henry finds himself in when you start Blank Frame, a puzzle adventure game by Through Tunnel. One uneventful night while lying in bed in his apartment, Henry hears a loud crash which startles him awake. When he steps outside his bedroom, he sees a giant metal cabinet has fallen through his roof from the floor above him, and completely blocks his front door. Unable to leave, and with the building's phone line down, Henry has to figure out what to do. At first, this obstacle doesn't seem too bad for him. He's a reclusive man and rarely leaves his apartment, so he could just wait until morning to get some help. This changes once he finds an ominous note against his window, and he begins to feel that this problem runs deeper than just a random accident. The gameplay is a simple escape room adventure game. You find items to solve puzzles, with your goal being to eventually clear the front entrance and allow him to escape. Henry lives on an upper story in his apartment building, meaning he can't simply climb out the window. The nightlife of the city goes on around him, unaware of the seemingly desperate situation he now finds himself in. The apartment itself is relatively small, meaning it's not too hard to keep track of items and puzzles as you go room to room. The aesthetic of the game is very lo-fi. Everything looks a little bit fuzzy and unclear, even when looking at things up close. It helps to make his apartment feel somewhat otherworldly, especially when you look at the windows at the world going on without him. Eventually, after solving a few puzzles, you'll manage to get the attention of his neighbor Ava. While he's never spoken to her before, she realizes that her typically quiet neighbor must be in trouble, and offers to help. Now, with a link to the outside, Henry realizes that he's not the only one experiencing strange occurrences. The game is about 90 minutes long, so I won't spoil any more of the story, but I do want to talk about the gameplay. Firstly, the itch page says that the game is intended to be completed in one sitting, which means that it doesn't feature any save system. While the game isn't that long, it unfortunately means that in the very few instances where Henry finds himself in danger, you can die and lose all of your progress. Thankfully, it didn't happen to me, but I'd completely understand if that happened to someone, they may not be willing to jump back in and get to that point again. Secondly, while most of the puzzles are relatively straightforward, the game does still have that typical adventure game problem of randomly obscure solutions. For example, the game only lets you pick up puzzle items once you're in that section of the game, which leads to you having to check each location again every time you trigger a major event. Sometimes, things you couldn't even interact with before are now interactable. Like I said though, the apartment is very small, so this is only a minor nitpick. But it's frustrating when you finally realize that what you were missing was something you already checked out earlier but hadn't hit the trigger for yet. I will say though, you don't have to be a puzzle expert to clear this game. Most of them are relatively simple logic puzzles. Finally, the game features some incredibly creepy moments. If you haven't realized it by now, it's pretty clear that the game is inspired by Silent Hill 4, and some of the moments, especially later on, would feel incredibly at home in Silent Hill. You might just catch a glimpse of something strange outside Henry's window, a figure passing by a hallway, or a strange shape in the distance. As much as the game can be kind of obtuse at times, where it really shines is in its atmosphere. It manages to make a relatively normal apartment feel like the end of the world, and it continues to get creepier and creepier until you find a way to escape. C.H.A.I.N is a prime example of why I find itch.io as a platform so intriguing. Standing for chronological, haunted, anomalous, interconnected narrative, C.H.A.I.N is a collection of 20 short games with a very unique setup. Each game was developed by a different person, and none of the developers could communicate with each other about their game. Instead, the first person would pass their game to the second person, and then they would create the next game in the narrative. Once they were finished, that person would send only their game to the next person in the chain, meaning each developer could only see the one immediately before them and nothing else. The idea was that each game would contribute to the narrative, despite them being vastly different in tone and style. The game itself is presented as a CD case filled with each of the entries, numbered 1 to 20. In the fiction of the game, these discs were discovered back in 1997 in a US Navy base. However, they were dismissed as being regular PS1 games. In 2006, however, they were rediscovered and examined, only for the researchers to discover that there was no proof of these games ever having been published for the PlayStation. The discs, now referred to as specimens, are being examined and experimented on by an SCP-style organization. Each game comes with a document full of redacted information and experiment results, on top of teaching you how to play each specimen. Everything about the game's presentation and creation is amazing. It's a real testament to the creativity of the indie game community. So, how does it actually play? Well, I could break down every single game in here, but it would take way too long. While the whole thing only took me about 2 hours to complete, which averages to about 6 minutes per game, they're also wildly different in both style and quality that it would be far too much. Instead, I want to talk about some specific ones that I really enjoyed, and also highlight some very interesting moments. The beginning of the chain is a game called Torch, which is a very simple atmospheric game about a girl walking through a cave with a lit torch. There's no dialogue or story, so when she reaches the end and sees a wall of white light, it's up to the next developer to determine what exactly happened to her. The second game, titled Miss Blanche, is our first moment of establishing the story. Now in first person, the girl finds herself on a beach, while the mysterious man in a suit speaks to her without turning to face her. He calls her Miss Blanche, and refers to other participants, implying that she's part of some sort of experiment. While the man's words are incredibly cryptic, he at least gives us some information to go on. After leading her into the ocean for what feels like an eternity, we eventually lose sight of him and Miss Blanche begins to drown. The third game, titled The Participants, arguably offers the biggest change. Control has now shifted to the man in the suit, and the gameplay is almost like an isometric GBA game. We discover that Miss Blanche isn't dead, but is instead fighting some internal struggle. From here on, everything begins to go off the rails. Because each game can't fully recap everything that's happened in the story so far, the next developer is left to interpret whatever clues they have. By the fifth specimen, titled Drip, Miss Blanche has become a completely different character, now depicted as the mastermind behind the experiments. This is what makes the chain so interesting, seeing what aspects of the game before it the next developer latches onto. For example, around specimen 11, eyeballs become a prominent theme, and each following game features them as a sort of antagonist. Then specimen 14 introduces books to the gameplay, which then reoccurs over the next couple of games. While the final result isn't exactly a straightforward narrative, there are little arcs and recurring themes, which is incredibly impressive for how it was made. Not all of the games are equal. Some are a lot more graphically impressive, others are a lot shorter, but all in all, it's a fascinating experience. My favorite game in the chain is Specimen 12, Avert Your Eyes, which I can only describe as a nightmarish Snapchat video. It's one of those games that's almost impossible to decipher while watching a video, and you just have to experience it for yourself. With incredible presentation and a super interesting development story, C.H.A.I.N is a beautiful experiment in collaboration. Thanks for watching. If you're new here, I very much appreciate you watching this video the whole way through. I took some time off in the last month for personal reasons, and I'm excited to get back into making videos. If you have any itch games you want me to check out, then leave them in the comments as always. And if you aren't subscribed, then please consider doing so if you like this video. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you again real soon.